The school board denied this student scholarship, but I'm here to ensure it's reinstated. I've decided to personally fund it.
The air conditioning in the administrative wing of the university hummed with a frequency that seemed designed to induce anxiety, a low mechanical drone that buried itself deep in the inner ear. Marcus sat at the far end of a table that was likely carved from a single ancient oak, its surface polished to a mirror sheen that reflected the distorted faces of the 6 board members staring back at him. He adjusted the knot of his tie, a piece of silk his grandfather had worn to church for 30 years, and waited for the silence to break. It was not a comfortable silence. It was the heavy, pressurized quiet of a room where a decision had already been made long before the subject walked through the door. They called this a scholarship review hearing, but it felt more like an arraignment for a crime he had not committed. The crime, it seemed, was the audacity of expectation. Marcus had spent the last 4 years ensuring his transcript was a fortress of straight A's and extracurricular excellence, a shield he built to protect himself from moments exactly like this one. Yet, as he looked at the vice-chancellor, a man who smiled with his mouth but never his eyes, Marcus realized that a shield is useless when the weapon being used against you is a fountain pen and a policy change. The vice-chancellor cleared his throat, a sound that cracked through the room like a dry branch snapping in a winter forest. He shuffled a stack of papers, the sound of dry skin on crisp paper amplified by the room's acoustics. Marcus watched the man's hands. They were soft, uncalloused hands, hands that had never had to scrub a floor or carry a crate, hands that held the power to alter the trajectory of Marcus's entire lineage with a single signature. The man began to speak, his voice maintaining a level, bureaucratic calm that was almost more insulting than shouting would have been. He spoke of new federal guidelines. He spoke of risk management. He spoke of the need for the university to remain competitive and inclusive. He used words like colorblind and meritocracy, weaponizing them with a precision that left Marcus breathless. The scholarship Marcus had applied for, the Herschel Lee Hamilton Memorial Fund, was established decades ago specifically to support black medical students in a state where, for a century, black bodies were used for medical practice but rarely allowed to practice medicine. It was a restorative justice measure. It was a correction. But today, inside this mahogany-paneled room, history was being rewritten. "We have received guidance," the vice-chancellor said, avoiding eye contact and focusing instead on the framed portrait of a founder on the far wall, that race-exclusive financial aid may violate Title VI and recent interpretations of the Constitution. Therefore, effective immediately, the Hamilton Fund has been dissolved and its assets frozen pending a restructuring into a general need-based pool. We simply cannot be seen as exclusionary. The irony hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The university, which had explicitly excluded Marcus's ancestors from even walking on the grass of the campus quad until 1968, was now claiming that a scholarship meant to address that injury was the real act of discrimination. Marcus felt the blood rising in his neck, a heat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. This was the moment he had been warned about. This was the invisible wall. He thought of his mother, working double shifts at the logistics center to pay for his prep courses. He thought of the hours he spent in the library while his peers were at parties, the sheer volume of life he had sacrificed on the altar of being good enough. And here he was, being told that his excellence was irrelevant because the mechanism designed to see him had been deemed unfair to those who had never needed to be seen. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, to cite the donor's intent, to argue the logic of equity versus equality, but the words died in his throat. He realized, with a sinking clarity, that this was not a debate. This was a notification. The board members were not looking at him as a student with a future. They were looking at him as a liability to be managed. One of the trustees, a woman with silver hair and a string of pearls that likely cost more than Marcus's family home, offered a sympathetic nod. "We understand this is disappointing," she said, her voice dripping with a pity that felt like acid. "But you are a bright young man. Surely you can apply for the general loans like everyone else." Everyone else. The phrase echoed in his mind. Everyone else did not have the weight of 400 years of systemic theft pressing down on their shoulders. Everyone else did not have to prove they belonged in the room before they could even ask for a seat at the table. Marcus stood up slowly. He smoothed the front of his suit jacket. He did not slam his fist on the table. He did not raise his voice. He knew that any display of anger would only validate their decision. It would transform him from a victim of bureaucracy into an angry caricature. So he simply nodded, picked up his leather portfolio, and turned to the door. The walk to the exit felt miles long. He could feel their eyes boring into his back, watching to see if he would break. He would not give them the satisfaction. As he stepped out into the hallway, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him, the sound finalized the erasure. The scholarship was gone. The money was gone. But it was not just the financial loss that stung. It was the message. The message was clear. You are welcome here only as long as you do not ask us to acknowledge why it is harder for you to be here. This is what we call the black tax. It is not a literal tax collected by the IRS, though it might as well be. It is the emotional and psychological levy placed on black people in professional spaces. It is the requirement to remain calm when you are being insulted. It is the necessity of navigating a maze of unwritten rules that seem to shift the moment you learn them. It is the exhaustion of having to justify your presence in spaces that were built with the capital of your ancestors but designed to keep you out. Marcus walked down the long, silent corridor of the administration building, passing portraits of past deans, all of whom looked like the men he had just left. He felt small. He felt defeated. He wondered if the medical degree was worth this erosion of his spirit. He wondered if he should just go home. But this story does not end in the hallway. This is not a tragedy about a student who gave up. This is a story about the moment the system overplayed its hand. Because what the board members in that room did not know, what they could not possibly have calculated in their risk assessments and legal briefs, was that they were being watched. They did not know that the cancellation of the Hamilton Fund had sent ripples far beyond the campus walls. They did not know that a letter had been sent, not to the university president, but to a private address in Atlanta. They did not know that while they were busy debating the legality of affirmative action, a car was pulling up to the front of the building. A car that cost more than the endowment they had just frozen. The driver killed the engine. The passenger door opened. And a man stepped out who held the receipts. The board had focused so much on the legality of the scholarship that they forgot to check the power of the legacy behind it. They thought they were burying a program. They were actually planting a seed. Marcus reached the glass doors at the end of the hall and pushed them open, stepping into the blinding midday sun. He didn't know it yet, but the cavalry had just arrived. To understand what is about to happen, we have to understand the mechanism of the trap Marcus just walked out of. It is called the open loop of systemic denial. It works by creating a problem, historical inequality, and then punishing any attempt to solve it by labeling the solution as the real inequality. We saw this at the University of Alabama at Birmingham when they canceled the Hamilton Scholarship. We saw it at UC San Diego when the Black Alumni Scholarship was forced to rebrand. We saw it when Stormzy was told by Oxford to take his money elsewhere. It is a pattern. A loop. But every loop has a breaking point. And in this story, the breaking point is walking up the steps right now. This is the counter story. The story that doesn't just catalog the oppression, but deconstructs the victory that follows. Because usually, when a student like Marcus is denied, the story ends. He takes the loans, he struggles, he burns out, or he succeeds in silence. But today, the silence is about to be broken. Today, we are going to look at 3 specific lessons on how to dismantle the gatekeepers. We are going to talk about the defense of excellence. We are going to talk about the true cost of code switching. And we are going to talk about the receipts. Because when you try to erase a legacy, you better make sure you deleted the backups. The man ascending the stairs adjusted his cufflinks. He checked his watch. He wasn't just a donor. He was the living embodiment of the history they tried to archive. He walked past Marcus, their shoulders brushing for a brief second. Marcus didn't recognize him, but he felt the shift in the air. It was the displacement of atmosphere that happens when a predator enters an ecosystem that has grown too comfortable. The man didn't look at Marcus. He was focused on the double doors of the administration building. He was focused on the 6 board members who were currently congratulating themselves on a difficult but necessary decision. They were about to have a very different conversation. This is the anatomy of a comeback. This is what happens when the check clears, but the respect bounces. Welcome to the other side of the story. The fluorescent lights in the administrative corridor hummed with a frequency that seemed audible only to those waiting for bad news. Marcus sat on a bench upholstered in a shade of institutional blue that was designed to be durable rather than comfortable. He held the rejection letter in his hand, not reading it, but feeling the weight of the paper stock. It was heavy, linen-finished paper. The university did not skimp on the quality of their stationery, even when they were using it to dismantle a legacy. The letter was polite. It was filled with words like risk management and compliance and race-neutral criteria. It cited vague legal threats and warnings from federal administrations that viewed history as a liability rather than a lesson. But beneath the bureaucratic prose, Marcus felt the familiar, crushing weight of an invisible tariff. He was paying the tax. This is the part of the story usually edited out of the brochures. We love the photos of the diverse graduates throwing their caps in the air, the smiles bright and unburdened. We rarely discuss the physics required to get that cap into the air. We rarely discuss the black tax. This tax is not filed with the IRS. It is an energetic surcharge levied on existence. It is the exhaustion of having to prove, repeatedly, that you belong in a room that was built with the specific intention of keeping you out. For Marcus, the scholarship wasn't just money. It was a validation that the institution saw him. The Herschel Lee Hamilton Endowed Scholarship, the one they had just canceled, was established to honor a physician and civil rights leader who had fought for the very right to study medicine in these halls. By canceling it, the board wasn't just saving money or avoiding a lawsuit. They were unwriting a chapter of history. They were telling Marcus that the specific struggles of his ancestors were no longer relevant enough to warrant specific support. They were suggesting that the playing field was now level, despite the fact that the ground beneath Marcus's feet felt like it was shifting at a 45-degree angle. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was temperature-controlled and devoid of history. 6 men and 2 women sat around a table made of mahogany that had been harvested before any of them were born. They were not evil people in the cinematic sense. They did not twirl mustaches or cackle. They were simply custodians of the status quo. They viewed their decision to dissolve the black medical student scholarship as a necessary adjustment to a changing legal landscape. They had read the memos about the Anti-KKK Act being weaponized to sue funds that supported black students. The irony of using a law designed to dismantle the Klan to dismantle civil rights scholarships was lost on them, buried under layers of legal counsel and risk avoidance. They spoke of rebranding. They spoke of opening the funds to all students who had overcome challenges, diluting the specific remedy for a specific injury until it was just a generic prize for grit. They were congratulating themselves on their prudence. They believed they were protecting the university's endowment. They did not realize they were bankrupting its soul. The concept of the black tax extends beyond the immediate financial burden. It manifests in the psychological gymnastics required to navigate these spaces. Consider the case in Georgia, a story that Marcus had read about and which haunted him as he sat in that hallway. An anonymous donor had to step in because the high school's scholar-athlete banquets were overwhelmingly white, while the football team that brought the school glory and revenue was predominantly black. The school was happy to cheer for them on Friday nights under the stadium lights, to consume their physical labor and their athletic excellence. But when it came time to celebrate intellectual achievement, the demographics shifted instantly. The systems of support, the tutors, the expectations of academic success, were funneled away from the players and toward a different demographic. The donor in Georgia saw the gap. He saw that the students were being taxed for their athleticism, pigeonholed into bodies rather than minds. He offered to pay for a semester of college for every semester a black athlete earned straight A's. He had to use his own money to purchase the equity that the school system refused to provide. That is the tax. It is the reliance on private miracles to solve public failures. Marcus stared at the closed double doors. He knew that what was happening to him was happening everywhere. At the University of Alabama at Birmingham, legacies were being erased. At UC San Diego, specific funds were being generalized into obscurity. Even in the UK, artists like Stormzy were being told by prestigious universities to take their funding elsewhere before finding partners who understood the mission. It was a global contraction. The institutions were closing ranks. They were tired of talking about race. They wanted to move on. But they wanted to move on without settling the debt. They wanted the reconciliation without the truth. Marcus felt the anger rising in his chest, not as a hot flash, but as a cold, hard clarity. He realized that he had been playing a game where the rules changed the moment he started winning. He had defended his excellence. He had maintained his grades. He had done the community service. He had code-switched, softening his voice and straightening his tie to make them comfortable. And it wasn't enough. This narrative we are embarking on is not just about a single check being written or denied. Over the course of this series, we are going to unpack the three pillars of this invisible economy. First, we will explore the defense of excellence, the exhausting requirement to be twice as good to get half as far, and how that standard is used as a gatekeeping mechanism. We will look at how perfection is demanded of the oppressed while mediocrity is subsidized for the privileged. Second, we will dismantle the code switch, the linguistic and behavioral contortions Black students and professionals perform to survive in corporate and academic environments. We will examine the cost of leaving your authentic self at the door just to get a seat at the table. And finally, we will examine the receipts. We will look at the logical, mathematical, and economic arguments that win these battles. Because you cannot fight accounting with emotion. You must fight it with better accounting. You must show them that racism is not just immoral, it is expensive. It is a bad investment. The air in the hallway seemed to compress. The donor, the man Marcus had not yet recognized, was now standing directly in front of the double doors. He was not paying the tax. He had come to collect a refund. He stood there for a moment, his hand hovering over the brass handle. He was a man who understood the difference between price and value. The board members inside knew the price of the scholarship. They knew exactly how many dollars they would save by canceling it. But they did not know the value of the legacy they were destroying. They did not know the value of the man standing outside their door. He adjusted his suit jacket. It was a movement of preparation, like a knight lowering a visor or a boxer tapping gloves. He didn't knock. Only people who are asking for permission knock. People who own the building just walk in. The silence in the corridor was no longer empty, it was pregnant with consequence. The narrative was about to pivot from a tragedy of bureaucracy to a thriller of accountability. Marcus looked up just as the handle turned. The latch clicked with the sound of a pistol hammer being cocked. This was the moment the tension broke, not into relief, but into confrontation. The open loop of history was about to be closed, not by a committee, but by a force of nature. The board believed they had successfully archived the problem. They believed the meeting was effectively over. They were wrong. The meeting was just beginning. The donor pushed the doors open, and the rush of air that followed him into the room felt less like a draft and more like a reckoning. The heavy mahogany doors did not slam, they clicked shut with the finality of a coffin lid closing, sealing the atmosphere inside the boardroom. The air conditioning hummed a low, indifferent monotone that seemed to underline the silence of the 12 board members seated around the oval table. They were frozen mid-motion, pens hovering over legal pads, water glasses halfway to dry lips. Dr. Elias Sterling stood at the head of the room, a man whose presence occupied more space than his physical frame should allow. He was wearing a suit that looked older than the youngest person in the room, yet it was pressed with a military precision that commanded instant respect. He did not look at the chairman, who was already half rising to issue an objection. He did not look at the university legal counsel, who was frantically shuffling papers to find a clause to eject him. Dr. Sterling looked only at Marcus. It was a look of profound recognition, a silent communication that acknowledged the invisible weight the boy was carrying. Then he placed a single leather-bound folio on the polished wood surface. The sound it made was soft but heavy like a gavel made of velvet. This was the first pillar of the counter-narrative, the defense of excellence, not as a plea for mercy but as a demand for accuracy. The chairman cleared his throat, a sound that grated against the tension like sandpaper. He began to recite the rehearsed talking points about the new federal guidance and the risk of litigation under the Anti-KKK Act of 1871, a cruel irony that twisted a law meant to protect freedmen into a weapon against their descendants. He spoke of race-neutral criteria and the need to rebrand the fund to avoid excluding other demographics. He used words like fairness and meritocracy as if they were shields. Dr. Sterling listened until the chairman ran out of breath. He did not shout. He did not flip the table. He simply opened the folio. Inside were not legal threats but spreadsheets. Rows and rows of data that told a story the board had carefully ignored. He slid the book toward the center of the table. The friction of the leather against the varnish hissed like a warning. He began to speak, and his voice was a deep resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in the chest cavities of everyone present. He told them he had spent the last semester observing their definitions of merit. He had attended the football games on Friday nights where the players were predominantly black, generating millions in revenue and prestige for the institution. He had then attended the scholar-athlete banquets on Saturday nights where the award recipients were overwhelmingly white. He asked a question that hung in the air like smoke. He asked if the board believed that melanin interfered with cognitive function, or if perhaps the criteria for excellence had been calibrated to measure only one specific frequency of success. This was the moment the narrative shifted from a defensive posture to an offensive revelation. Dr. Sterling recounted the story of the anonymous donor in Georgia, a man who saw the same disparity and offered to pay for a full semester of college for every black athlete who earned straight A's. The school administration had panicked. They had tried to block it. They had argued it was unfair to the other students. But the donor had persisted, and within 1 year the GPA of the football team had skyrocketed. The excellence was always there, waiting to be funded, waiting to be acknowledged. Dr. Sterling pointed a finger at the board members not as an accusation but as a diagnosis. He explained that by canceling the Herschel Lee Hamilton Scholarship and forcing it to rebrand into a generic need-based grant, they were not upholding the law, they were erasing a legacy. They were taking a badge of honor meant to celebrate resilience and turning it into a receipt for poverty. He argued that excellence in the face of systemic headwinds is a different category of achievement than excellence born of ease. A 4.0 GPA from a student who works the night shift to pay rent is not the same number as a 4.0 GPA from a student who has a private tutor. Mathematically, they are identical. Contextually, they are worlds apart. The board wanted to strip the context. Dr. Sterling was there to weld it back on. The room grew smaller as he spoke. The board members shifted in their ergonomic chairs, suddenly uncomfortable in their expensive suits. Dr. Sterling moved around the table, walking slowly behind them like a professor proctoring an exam. He spoke of the Stormzy Scholarship at Cambridge and how Oxford had initially turned the musician away, telling him to get lost. He spoke of the arrogance of institutions that believe they are the sole arbiters of worthiness. He reminded them that when you exclude a demographic from the definition of excellence, you do not preserve the standard, you lower it. You create a false meritocracy, a closed loop where the privileged congratulate each other on their hard work while ignoring the wind at their backs. He stopped behind Marcus's chair and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. It was a grounding touch, a transfer of energy. He told the board that Marcus was not in that room asking for a favor. He was not asking for a handout. He was the creditor, and the university was the debtor. The scholarship was not a gift, it was a down payment on the future value Marcus would bring to the field of medicine. To deny him now based on a fear of a lawsuit was not prudent management. It was a breach of contract with the future. The legal counsel tried to interject again, citing the specific language of the endowment and the pressure from the donor class to keep things non-controversial. Dr. Sterling laughed, a dry, mirthless sound. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a checkbook. He tossed it onto the folio. He told them that the original donors, the Hamilton family, were heartbroken not because the money was gone but because the university had proven itself unworthy of the name. He revealed that he was not just a concerned citizen. He was the one who had been quietly funding the gap whenever the state cuts came down. He was the safety net they didn't know they were walking on. And he was now threatening to pull the net away. He explained that true excellence requires courage. The courage to stand by a mission statement even when the political winds shift. The courage to say that supporting black students specifically is not an act of exclusion but an act of correction. He looked at the chairman and delivered the ultimatum. They could keep their race-neutral language. They could dilute the fund until it meant nothing. But if they did, the checkbook stayed closed and the endowment would be withdrawn, entirely moved to a historically black college or university that understood the value of the investment. The choice was theirs. They could defend their bureaucracy or they could defend excellence. They could not do both. The silence that followed the ultimatum was not empty but heavy, filled with the sudden realization that the power dynamic in the room had shifted on its axis. The air conditioning system hummed a low, monotonous drone that seemed to grow louder as the board members exchanged nervous glances, their eyes darting between the closed checkbook and the man who held the pen. The chairman cleared his throat, a sound that cracked like dry timber in the quiet room, and leaned forward with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, attempting to wrestle control back through the familiar mechanics of bureaucracy. He spoke of compromise, of modernizing the language, of finding a middle ground where the intent remained but the specific vocabulary was sanitized for legal safety. He mentioned precedents set by other institutions, citing a university in San Diego that had rebranded a black alumni fund to focus on general adversity, and a medical program in Alabama that had dissolved a similar endowment under pressure. He called it strategic evolution, a way to keep the money flowing without attracting the ire of political watchdogs. He was suggesting they simply turn down the volume on the scholarship's identity. This suggestion triggered a memory in the donor, pulling him away from the polished mahogany table and back into the deep recesses of his own history. He thought of the internal volume knob. It is a mechanism installed early in the minds of black children, a psychological mixing console that must be adjusted constantly to survive in spaces not built for them. He remembered being 7 years old and learning that his joy was too loud for the library, that his anger was too threatening for the playground, and that his intelligence was too arrogant for the classroom. He learned to reach inside and twist the dial, dampening the treble of his enthusiasm and cutting the bass of his assertiveness until he hit a frequency that made white authority figures comfortable. It was a tax paid in decibels, a constant modulation of self that required an exhausting amount of mental energy to maintain. Every interaction was a sound check. Is this tone too aggressive? Is this laughter too boisterous? Is this silence too sullen? The board members sitting opposite him had never touched such a dial in their lives. They existed at full volume, their defaults accepted as the standard setting for the world. He looked at the file on the table, the one containing the rejected application of the student whose scholarship was in question. This young man was a physics prodigy, who also happened to be the captain of his high school football team. The donor knew the type well. The world was perfectly comfortable with this boy's volume when he was on the field, when the roar of the crowd demanded aggression and physical dominance. In that context, they wanted the bass turned all the way up. They cheered for the collision, for the raw kinetic energy of his black body in motion. But the moment that same boy walked into a physics lab or a scholarship interview, the requirements inverted. Suddenly, he was expected to shrink, to soften, to make himself non-threatening. The donor had seen it happen in Georgia, where a philanthropist noticed that the scholar-athlete banquets were overwhelmingly white while the football teams were predominantly black. The system was happy to consume their athletic labor but refused to acknowledge their intellectual volume. The donor realized that the board was asking him to inflict this same schizophrenia on the scholarship itself. They wanted the money, the prestige of diversity, but they wanted it on mute. The chairman continued his pitch, suggesting they use phrases like overcoming major challenges or urban leadership potential instead of explicitly naming black students. He argued that this was the smart play, the way to navigate the current political climate where race-conscious funding was being hunted down like an error in the code. He referenced the lawsuit that had forced the rebrand in San Diego, painting it as a cautionary tale. But the donor heard something else. He heard the sound of an institution folding, of courage leaking out of the room like air from a punctured tire. This was the same logic that led Oxford University to initially dismiss a grime artist's offer to fund black scholars, telling him to get lost before realizing their mistake only after he took his money and his mission to Cambridge. It was a logic of fear, a belief that the only way to survive was to become invisible. The donor knew that rewriting the scholarship to be race-neutral was not a strategy, it was an erasure. It was taking the legacy of a civil rights leader, a man who had marched and bled for specific recognition, and diluting it into a bland soup of generalities. The donor imagined the student, the physics prodigy, walking into this room. He imagined the boy checking his internal volume knob, his hand hovering over the dial, preparing to dim his light to fit the room's wattage. If this scholarship was rebranded, if it was stripped of its specific mission, it would just be another space where that boy had to negotiate his existence. The donor understood that true equity is not about everyone whispering at the same level. It is about building a room soundproofed enough to handle the full volume of everyone's humanity. He looked at the chairman, who was now outlining a 5-year plan for the rebranded fund, and felt a cold clarity wash over him. The compromise they were offering was a betrayal disguised as a handshake. He interrupted the chairman mid-sentence, his voice low but resonant, carrying the weight of decades of modulation that he was finally choosing to switch off. He explained that the internal volume knob is a survival tool, yes, but it is also a cage. He told them that for 50 years, he had adjusted his frequency to sit in boardrooms like this one, to accumulate the wealth that now sat in the account they so desperately wanted to retain. He had played their game. He had spoken the king's English, he had dressed the part, he had smiled when he wanted to scream. But he had done so with a singular purpose, to one day build a sanctuary where the next generation would not have to touch that dial. This scholarship was that sanctuary. It was the one place in the university where a black student could be fully themselves, without apology, without modulation, without the need to code switch. The donor picked up the file of the rejected student and held it up. He described the mental gymnastics this student performed every day. He spoke of the cognitive dissonance of being celebrated for physical labor on the field while being suspected of intellectual fraud in the classroom. He told them about the time he walked into a donor banquet in Georgia, similar to the one this student might attend, and saw the invisible lines of segregation drawn not by law, but by the quiet expectations of volume. The white students were allowed to be loud, to take up space, to be mediocre and still be celebrated. The black students were expected to be grateful, to be exceptionally perfect just to be considered present. By asking to remove the racial criteria from the scholarship, the board was asking to remove the only thing that acknowledged this specific burden. They were saying that the black tax didn't exist, that the extra energy required to navigate these spaces was imaginary. He leaned in closer, his eyes locking with the chairman's. He told him that changing the name to the Goins Alumni Scholarship or some other neutral moniker was not an act of inclusion. It was an act of cowardice. It was an admission that the university was more afraid of a lawsuit than it was committed to its own students. It was the administrative equivalent of telling Stormzy to get lost. He explained that when you dilute a medicine, you destroy its efficacy. This scholarship was medicine for a specific ailment, the systemic underrepresentation and psychological isolation of black scholars. You do not give chemotherapy to a patient with a broken arm, and you do not give a general hardship fund to cure a specific exclusion. If they opened it to everyone who had overcome challenges, they would eventually fill the slots with students who face challenges, certainly, but not the specific challenge of being black in an institution built on their exclusion. The room fell silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of calculation, it was the silence of shame. The donor let the words hang in the air, forcing them to confront the reality of what they were asking. They were asking him to be complicit in the erasure of his own people. They were asking him to turn the knob down on his own legacy. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him, severing the air-conditioned silence of the boardroom from the humid, echoing reality of the university corridor. Marcus stood there for a moment, his hand still hovering near the brass handle, listening to the muffled murmurs of the trustees scrambling to process his departure. They were likely already calling legal counsel, frantically looking for a loophole in the contract of his donation, hoping to find a way to keep the millions while discarding the mandate attached to them. He adjusted his cufflinks, feeling the weight of the gold against his wrist, and began the long walk down the gallery of past presidents. It was a tunnel of oil-painted eyes, row after row of stern men in academic regalia, who had presided over this institution during years when men like Marcus were only allowed on campus to sweep the floors or trim the hedges. The silence of the hallway was not empty, it was crowded with ghosts. And among them, one figure stood taller than the rest, not in a painting, but in the architecture of Marcus's own memory. The smell of the university, floor wax and old paper, faded, replaced instantly by the sharp, medicinal scent of rubbing alcohol and peppermint. The timeline fractured. The polished terrazzo beneath his Italian loafers dissolved into the cracked linoleum of a waiting room in Birmingham, 40 years ago. It was the waiting room of Dr. Herschel Lee Hamilton. To the city, Dr. Hamilton was a physician. To the community, he was a fortress. Marcus remembered sitting on the edge of a plastic chair, his legs swinging, too short to touch the ground. He had watched the steady stream of patients come in, not just with broken bones or fevers, but with broken spirits and systemic wounds. This was the man who had treated the Freedom Riders when the white hospitals turned them away. This was the man who stitched up the lacerations caused by police batons during the marches, working in silence, working with a precision that defied the chaos outside his clinic walls. Dr. Hamilton did not just practice medicine, he practiced survival. Marcus remembered the day he was called into the back office, not for a checkup, but for a lesson. The office was a sanctuary of dark wood and bound books, a stark contrast to the underfunded schools Marcus attended. Dr. Hamilton sat behind a desk that seemed wide enough to land a plane on, his stethoscope draped around his neck like a badge of office that no law could revoke. He had looked at Marcus over the rim of his glasses, his eyes holding a depth of sorrow and steel that a child could sense but not fully understand. He had slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a rejection letter. Not for him, but for a student he was trying to sponsor. The university had returned the check. They claimed the funds could not be restricted to Negro students because it violated the spirit of integration. Dr. Hamilton had laughed then, a dry, humorless sound that rattled in his chest. He told Marcus that integration was being used as a weapon against the very people it was supposed to help. He explained that when you burn down a man's house, you don't get to claim equality by forbidding him from buying lumber to rebuild it. He taught Marcus that specific harm requires specific remedy. If you break a leg, you don't put a cast on the arm in the name of fairness. You treat the break. The scholarship he was trying to build wasn't about exclusion, it was about triage. It was emergency medicine for a generation that had been systematically bled out. He told Marcus that day that money is energy. It is potential. And in the hands of a black man in America, it is a battery that must be charged twice as hard because the world is constantly trying to drain it. Marcus stopped walking in the present-day hallway, staring at a portrait of a dean from the 1980s. This was the era when they told Dr. Hamilton that his specific scholarship was divisive. The argument hadn't changed, it had only put on a more expensive suit. The board members back in that room were using the same logic. They cited the recent warnings from the federal administration, they cited the lawsuits in California against alumni funds, they cited the threats to their federal funding. They spoke of colorblindness, as if it were a virtue, ignoring that being colorblind in a world designed by color is just a convenient form of blindness. They wanted to take the Hamilton legacy and dilute it into a general fund for disadvantaged students. They wanted to wash the blackness off the money so they could spend it without guilt. They wanted the prestige of the civil rights connection without the discomfort of the civil rights reality. They wanted the name of the doctor on the building, but they didn't want the patients he served in the classroom. This was the betrayal. It wasn't just a breach of contract, it was a breach of the intergenerational covenant. The mentor had warned him about this. Dr. Hamilton had said that the hardest thing to protect would not be the money itself, but the intent behind it. He knew that institutions have an immune response to black autonomy. Like a body rejecting a transplant, the system fights against any resource that is exclusively controlled by and for the marginalized. Marcus realized now why the meeting had felt so suffocating. It wasn't the negotiation of terms, it was the erasure of history. By opening the scholarship to all students who face challenges, they were effectively saying that the specific history of slavery, of Jim Crow, of redlining, and of the medical apartheid Dr. Hamilton fought against, was just generic challenge. They were flattening the mountains his ancestors had climbed into a level playing field that didn't exist. The anger that had been a cold geometry in the boardroom now began to heat up, fueling his stride as he reached the end of the gallery. He pushed through the double doors and stepped out into the blinding sunlight of the campus quad. Students were everywhere, a sea of backpacks and headphones. He scanned the crowd, looking for the faces that looked like his. He saw a few. A young man with dreadlocks pulled back in a tie, carrying a stack of chemistry textbooks. A young woman in scrubs, sitting on a bench, looking exhausted. These were the ones Dr. Hamilton had saved his money for. These were the ones the open loop was meant to close. If Marcus allowed the board to repurpose the funds, he wouldn't just be losing a tax write-off, he would be stealing the ladder that had been lowered down to them. He would be complicit in the lie that says, "We are all the same now," while the statistics on the ground screamed otherwise. He remembered the story of the anonymous donor in Georgia who noticed that the scholar-athlete banquets were overwhelmingly white, despite the football team being predominantly black. The donor realized that the system was happy to extract the physical labor of the black students on the field, but offered no support for their intellectual labor in the classroom. The donor didn't ask for permission to change it, he just paid the tuition. Direct action. Direct injection of resources. That was what Dr. Hamilton represented. He didn't wait for the hospital board to approve his methods, he just healed the people. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The notification from his bank stared back at him. The balance was high. The power was there. But the power was useless if it couldn't be directed with precision. The board wanted a fire hose that sprayed water everywhere. Marcus needed a laser that cut through the chains of debt specific to these students. He walked toward his car, the gravel crunching under his feet like the bones of the argument he had just dismantled. He thought of Stormzy in the UK, facing the same polite rejection from Oxford, the same "we don't do things like that here" attitude. And what did Stormzy do? He went down the road to Cambridge and built it himself. He didn't wait for the institution to validate his mission. He forced the institution to catch up to his morality. That was the lesson the mentor had planted in Marcus's chest all those years ago. You do not ask for equity. You finance it. You do not beg for a seat at the table. You build your own table and you make it out of gold and mahogany, and you invite who you damn well please. The intergenerational link wasn't just a metaphor. It was a supply line. And the board had just tried to cut it. Marcus stopped at the door of his car, looking back at the administration building, a towering edifice of brick and ivy. It looked impenetrable. But he knew something they didn't. He knew that buildings crumble when the foundation shifts. And he was about to shift the foundation. He wasn't leaving to retreat. He was leaving to reload. The mentor's voice was clear in his ear now, drowning out the ambient noise of the campus. They will take everything you offer them, Dr. Hamilton had said, except your truth. So make them pay for the truth first. Marcus realized that the scholarship wasn't the end of the fight, it was the bait. He had exposed their true nature. He had forced them to admit that they preferred to lose millions of dollars rather than explicitly support black excellence. That admission was a weapon. That admission was the receipts. And he was going to frame those receipts and hang them in the court of public opinion. He opened the car door, the heat of the interior rushing out to meet him. He sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel. He wasn't just Marcus anymore. He was the vessel for Dr. Hamilton, for the anonymous donors, for the alumni fighting in courts in California, for every grandmother who put $1 in the collection plate for a scholarship fund. He was the link in the chain that would not break. He started the engine. It purred with a low, dangerous rumble. The volume was indeed turned all the way up. The silence of the house was different from the silence of the car. It was the heavy, expectant silence of a library before a storm. Marcus spread the documents across the mahogany desk, the surface disappearing under a sea of white paper and highlighted text. This was the war room now. The meeting with the board had been a skirmish, a testing of defenses, but this next phase was the siege. He picked up the file labeled Birmingham. It was a tragedy printed in black ink. The University of Alabama at Birmingham had canceled the Herschel Lee Hamilton Endowed Scholarship, a fund specifically for black medical students, established to honor a civil rights leader, dismantled because of a vague warning from Washington. Marcus traced the name Hamilton with his finger. They called it compliance. He called it theft. Theft of legacy. Theft of the future doctors who would have healed communities that had been ignored for centuries. He placed the page in the center of the desk. This was Exhibit A. Next came the file from San Diego. The Black Alumni Scholarship Fund at UC San Diego forced to rebrand. They had stripped the word black from the title like it was a profanity. Now it was the Goins Alumni Scholarship, open to anyone who had overcome challenges. It sounded noble on the surface, a democratization of struggle, but Marcus knew the subtext. When you widen the net to include everyone, you conveniently lose the specific fish you were trying to starve. It was the erasure of specificity. It was the argument that acknowledging the unique hurdles of black students was, in itself, an act of discrimination against those who had never faced those hurdles. He stacked this paper on top of the first. Exhibit B. The pattern was undeniable. It was a coordinated retreat from the promises made during the civil rights era, a clawing back of the meager reparations that had been won in blood. He turned to the laptop screen, the blue light reflecting in his glasses. He pulled up the article about the anonymous donor in Georgia. This story was the counterweight. At Centennial High School, a donor had noticed the scholar-athlete banquets were white, while the football team that brought the school glory was black. The excellence was there on the field, but it was being filtered out before it reached the podium. So the donor bypassed the system. Straight as meant a full semester of college paid for. Direct action. No committees. No dilution of intent. Marcus smiled. That was the energy he needed. He didn't need the board's permission to be excellent. He needed to show them that their permission was irrelevant. He printed the article. Exhibit C. Finally, the notes on the British musician Stormzy. Oxford University had told him to get lost when he proposed a scholarship. They saw a rapper and saw a risk. They didn't see the visionary. So he went to Cambridge. Now, Cambridge was reaping the benefits of that brilliance, and Oxford was left with its pride and its empty hands. This was the ultimate receipt. The receipt that proved prejudice was a bad business decision. It wasn't just immoral, it was inefficient. It was financial suicide. Marcus gathered the stack of papers. These weren't just news clippings. They were the indictment. He wasn't going back to the board to beg for a scholarship. He was going back to show them the bill for the opportunities they had squandered. The morning sun hit the glass facade of the administrative building with a blinding glare, turning the structure into a fortress of light. Marcus walked through the automatic doors, his briefcase heavy in his hand. The receptionist looked up, her smile faltering as she recognized him. He didn't stop. He walked past the front desk, past the waiting area with its generic art and comfortable chairs designed to placate angry parents. He walked straight to the double doors of the conference room. He pushed them open. The conversation inside died instantly. The board members were there, coffees halfway to their mouths, papers shuffled in front of them. The superintendent sat at the head of the table, his face tightening into a mask of annoyed politeness. Marcus placed the briefcase on the table. The sound of the latches snapping open was loud in the sudden quiet. He didn't sit down. He took out the stack of papers he had compiled the night before. He slid the first document down the long polished table. It spun and came to a rest in front of the superintendent. It was the summary of the UAB cancellation. Marcus spoke, his voice low but filling the room. He told them that they were in dangerous company. He told them that history was currently being written, and they were drafting a chapter that would embarrass their grandchildren. He explained that by blocking the specific allocation of funds for black students, they weren't upholding fairness, they were participating in a nationwide rollback of progress. He pointed to the document. He asked them if they wanted to be remembered as the local branch of that failure. He slid the second document. The San Diego case. He anticipated their argument before they could make it. He knew they would claim they were protecting the district from lawsuits, that they were being prudent. He dismantled that defense. He explained that hiding behind the Anti-KKK Act to dismantle black scholarships was a perversion of law so grotesque it would be laughable if it weren't so destructive. He told them that rebranding erasure as inclusion was a trick that no longer worked. The community was watching. The donors were watching. He looked directly at the treasurer. He asked if the district could afford to alienate the very demographic that made up the majority of their star athletes, their cultural contributors, their future leaders. Then he played his strongest card. He brought up the Centennial High example. He told them about the anonymous donor who saw what the institution refused to see. He told them about the straight-A students who were invisible to the administration but visible to someone with a checkbook and a conscience. He leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the table. He told them that capital flows where it is respected. He told them that money, like water, finds the path of least resistance. If this board proved to be a dam blocking the flow of resources to deserving black students, the water would simply go around them. And when it did, it would wash away their relevance. He brought up Stormzy and Oxford. He used it as a parable of arrogance. He asked them if they felt like Oxford today. Did they feel like turning away a fortune because they didn't like the packaging? He told them that there was a donor ready to walk through that door. A donor who, like the one in Georgia, had seen the gap between the football field and the honor roll and wanted to build a bridge. But this donor wasn't going to write a check to a district that was ashamed of its own students. This donor required a partner, not an obstacle. Marcus let the silence stretch. He looked at each of them in turn. He was holding up a mirror, and for the first time, they seemed uncomfortable with the reflection. The superintendent cleared his throat. He tried to regain control of the room. He started to speak about policy, about the complexities of endowment laws, about the need for colorblind criteria to ensure equity for all. It was a rehearsed speech, dry and lifeless. It bounced off Marcus like pebbles off a tank. Marcus didn't interrupt. He let the man speak. He let the empty words fill the air until they suffocated themselves. When the superintendent finished, Marcus simply pointed to the stack of receipts on the table. He said that policy was a tool, not a deity. Policies are changed by people with the courage to do what is right. He asked them if there was a single person of courage in the room, or if they were all just administrators of decline. The door behind Marcus opened. He didn't turn around. He knew who it was. The timing was precise. The air in the room shifted. The board members looked past Marcus, their eyes widening slightly. It wasn't just a donor. It was the presence of consequences. It was the physical manifestation of the ultimatum Marcus had just delivered. The footsteps on the carpet were soft but deliberate. A figure moved to stand beside Marcus. It was an older man, impeccable in a suit that whispered old money, but with a lapel pin that screamed civil rights veteran. He carried no briefcase. He carried only an envelope. Marcus stepped aside. He had laid the groundwork. He had presented the receipts of the past failures. Now, it was time for the investment in the future. The older man placed the envelope on the table next to Marcus's dossier. He didn't look at the board, he looked at the receipts Marcus had laid out. He nodded, a slow, grave affirmation of the evidence. Then he looked up. He spoke with a voice that sounded like gravel crunching under tires. He told them that he had intended to endow a new wing for the science department. A generic gift. Safe. Uncontroversial. But after reviewing the research this young man had provided, After seeing how UAB and San Diego and Oxford had failed the test of history, he had changed his mind. He tapped the envelope. He told them that inside was a check. But the check had conditions. It was not for a building. It was for a trust. A trust specifically for the development of black scholars in the district. It was to replace what had been taken. It was to repair what had been broken. And if the board felt that this gift was too specific, too racial, too problematic for their colorblind policies, then he would take his check to the neighboring district. He would take it to a private school. He would take it to a historically black college. He would do a Stormzy. He would leave them with their policies and take the excellence elsewhere. The room was motionless. The superintendent looked at the envelope, then at the donor, then at Marcus. The equation had changed. This wasn't a student begging for a handout. This was a negotiation between power and bureaucracy. Marcus watched the realization dawn on them. They were terrified of the bad press from the UAB and UCSD stories, but they were even more terrified of losing the money sitting on the table. They were trapped by their own greed and fear. And that was the moral victory. They weren't going to accept the scholarship because it was the right thing to do. They were going to accept it because they couldn't afford not to. Marcus picked up his briefcase. He didn't need to say anything else. The receipts were on the table. The money was on the table. The choice was theirs, but he had already won. He turned and walked toward the door. As he reached for the handle, he heard the superintendent's chair scrape against the floor. He heard the stammering beginning of a concession. Marcus didn't smile. He didn't look back. He walked out into the hallway, the heavy doors closing behind him with a soft thud. He walked down the corridor, the fluorescent lights humming above him. He felt lighter. He had carried the weight of Hamilton, of Goins, of every denied student, and he had placed that weight where it belonged, on the shoulders of the people in charge. He walked toward the exit, the glare of the sun waiting for him, promising a heat that was real and cleansing. Twilight had settled over the city by the time Marcus unlocked the heavy oak door of his private study, the transition from the blinding afternoon sun to the cool, blue shadows of the room acting as a necessary balm for his senses. The adrenaline that had sustained him in the boardroom was fading, replaced by a deep, resonant exhaustion that settled in the marrow of his bones. He did not turn on the overhead lights. Instead, he walked to the vintage banker's lamp on his desk, pulling the brass chain to cast a pool of warm, amber light across the leather surface. In that circle of illumination lay a single file folder, unrelated to the victory he had just secured, yet inextricably linked to the war he was fighting. It was a dossier on the erosion of legacy, a collection of case studies that served as his map through this treacherous terrain. He sat down, the leather chair groaning softly, and poured himself a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly not from fear, but from the release of tension. The silence of the house was absolute, a stark contrast to the sterile, buzzing quiet of the superintendent's office. Here, surrounded by walls of books written by men and women who had bled for the right to be read, Marcus allowed himself to process the reality of what had just happened. He had forced their hand, yes, but he knew the nature of institutions. They were like water. If you blocked the flow in one direction, they would simply find a crack, a fissure, a weakness in the foundation to seep through elsewhere. The check he had slapped on the table was a temporary dam, but the pressure behind it was rising. He opened the dossier, his eyes landing on the clipping regarding the University of Alabama at Birmingham. It was a story that haunted him, a ghost that stood in the corner of every room where he negotiated equity. The Herschel Lee Hamilton, M.D., Endowed Scholarship. It was not merely a fund, it was a monument. Dr. Hamilton had been a civil rights leader, a man who had fought to integrate the very hospitals that now sought to erase his specific intent. The university had canceled the scholarship, citing warnings from a federal administration about race-conscious funding. The betrayal lay not in the loss of money, for money could be raised, but in the theft of memory. The donors had established that fund to honor a specific struggle, to pave a road for black medical students who faced hurdles invisible to their peers. By dissolving it, The institution had declared that the specific history of black exclusion was no longer relevant enough to warrant specific repair. Marcus traced the edge of the paper. This was the counter-story he had to keep alive. The dominant narrative said that removing race-based criteria was an act of fairness, a move toward a colorblind meritocracy. The counter-story revealed the truth, that colorblindness in a society built on color lines is merely a blindfold worn by the executioner. It was a way to ensure that the accumulated advantage of the majority remained undisturbed by the pesky intervention of equity. He turned the page, the sound loud in the quiet room. The next case study was from the West Coast, UC San Diego. The Black Alumni Scholarship Fund. He read the details of the lawsuit that had forced its rebranding. The irony was so sharp it could draw blood. The lawsuit had argued that the race-exclusive criteria were discriminatory under the Anti-KKK Act. A law designed to protect black people from white supremacist terror was being weaponized to dismantle programs designed to uplift black students. It was a perversion of history so profound it made Marcus feel a wave of nausea. The fund had been forced to become the Goins Alumni Scholarship Fund, open to all races, diluted to the point of irrelevance. They had taken the specificity of the black experience, the unique cultural and systemic challenges that the scholarship was meant to address, and dissolved it into a generic soup of community service and overcoming challenges. It was the administrative equivalent of all lives mattering a funeral. Marcus realized that his victory today in the school boardroom was fragile. If he wasn't careful, the district would find a way to dilute his donor agreement tomorrow. They would use legal jargon to widen the criteria until the scholarship meant nothing, until it was just another generic award that would inevitably flow toward those who already had the most support. This was the lesson of the open loop. You cannot just open the door, you have to stand in the doorway and hold it, or the wind will slam it shut. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights flickering in the distance. He thought about the anonymous donor in Georgia. A ghost in the machine. That philanthropist had seen the scholar-athlete banquets, saw the sea of white faces receiving awards while the football team, predominantly black, provided the labor and the glory for the school. The donor hadn't filed a lawsuit. They hadn't held a protest. They had simply offered to pay for a full semester of college for every semester a black athlete earned straight as. It was a direct injection of resources, bypassing the bureaucracy entirely. It was a subversive act of excellence. And then there was Stormzy, the British musician. When Oxford University told him to get lost, when the establishment sneered at his proposal, he didn't beg. He went to Cambridge. He built his own infrastructure. He proved that if the castle won't lower the drawbridge, you build a helicopter. Marcus saw his reflection in the darkened glass. He was not just a donor. He was a mechanic, working on the engine of a broken vehicle. The school board members viewed the scholarship as a charity, a handout to quell the noise. Marcus viewed it as a receipt. A proof of purchase for a seat at the table that had been denied for generations. Returning to his desk, Marcus pulled a fountain pen from his pocket, the same pen he had used to sign the check hours ago. He began to write on a fresh legal pad. This was the final lesson, the epilogue to the drama that had played out under the fluorescent lights of the district office. The lesson was that they would never love you. They would never welcome you with open arms simply because you were excellent. Excellence was not a request for affection, it was a demand for respect. The code switching he had employed, the calm demeanor, the tailored suit, the precise diction, it was not an act of submission. It was camouflage. It allowed him to infiltrate the room where the decisions were made. But now that he was in the room, the camouflage had to be dropped. The money he had provided came with strings, and those strings were made of steel. He wrote down the terms for the next phase. He would not just fund the students, he would mentor them. He would create a parallel curriculum, one that taught them the history of Herschel Lee Hamilton, the legal twists of the Anti-KKK Act, the strategy of the anonymous Georgia donor. He would teach them that their scholarship was not a gift from a benevolent system, but a restitution payment from a system that had tried to bankrupt their potential. The clock on the mantel chimed the hour, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Marcus capped his pen. The weight was still there, but it was different now. It was the good kind of weight, the kind that builds muscle. He thought of the student, the boy who had been denied, whose face was the catalyst for this entire crusade. That boy didn't know it yet, but he was about to inherit more than tuition. He was about to inherit a playbook. The school board thought they had lost a negotiation. In reality, they had just unwittingly authorized the construction of a fortress. Marcus turned off the banker's lamp, plunging the room back into darkness, save for the city lights outside. He walked out of the study, leaving the door open. The story wasn't over. The loop was not closed. It was merely expanding, spiraling upward, carried on the backs of those who refused to be written out of the narrative. The donor had walked in, yes. But he had no intention of walking away.